Hello, and welcome to The Real American Revolution, a multimedia program to discuss with noted authors and historians what really happened before, during, and after America's War for Independence. Now, my name is Randy Flood, and today my guest is historian David Price. David has authored 4 books, including a pair about the 10 crucial days of the American Revolution, The Road to Assunpink Creek, and Rescuing the Revolution, as well as John Haslett's World, and most recently, the Battle of Harlem Heights, 1776. Now, since 2021, David has authored 10 scholarly articles for the prestigious peer-reviewed Journal of the American Revolution, and is the recipient of the National Society of the Sons of the American Revolution Bronze Good Citizenship Medal and Certificate of Appreciation in recognition for his work as an author, a speaker, and a historical interpreter at Washington Crossing Historic Park and Princeton Battlefield State Park, both outstanding sites, to say the least. David's latest book, Winning the 10 Crucial Days, The Keys to Victory in George Washington's legendary winter campaign, is what we're going to talk about today. So, David, welcome to the Real American Revolution. We're delighted to have you.
Thank you, Randy. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk about Winning the 10 Crucial Days. First of all, tell us about your background and how this book originated.
Well, actually, I don't know if you're aware of this, but you and I have a common thread to a certain extent in terms of our career experiences because we were both legislative staff.
Oh, that's good.
You on the Hill, and I gather I did it a lot longer in Trenton, New Jersey. I was working for the Office of Legislative Services, which is the nonpartisan staff and research agency for the General Assembly and the Senate there. And I did that for 34 years and 2 months, but who's counting?
You're right.
No, actually, it was 31 years. I had another state job before that. My academic background, I don't have a degree in history, although I did minor in history in college. I have a couple of degrees in political science, which I suppose some people would say is the same as history, but don't tell that to a political scientist.
Right.
But I was bitten by the history bug at a very early age. I'm going to date myself now. My father took me to Gettysburg when I was, I guess it was the summer before I turned 8, and this was during the Civil War centennial. So I was really hooked at that point. And after I retired, I was looking for something to do to, keep from chewing the carpet, keep my wife from chewing the carpet too. And I knew that they were looking for tour guides. Excuse me. Well, they call them historical interpreters, but
right.
The only difference I've been able to ascertain between the two is the spelling. Up at Washington Crossing Historic Park, which is the Pennsylvania version of the, as you know, the two sister parks on the Delaware River. And so I went up there a few months after I retired and, started volunteering, offered my services. And then they unvolunteered me a couple of years later. But I've been giving tours there really for the last decade. I started, I think, in May of 14. More recently, as you alluded to, I started giving tours on a volunteer basis at Princeton Battlefield through a program that's jointly sponsored by the Princeton Battlefield Society in the state of New Jersey, which runs the park. And in fact, that park, Princeton, is for administrative purposes, I believe, is a subunit or subdivision of the New Jersey version of Washington Crossing State Park. So I've been doing that, and my literary activity is, as you can imagine, an outgrowth of what I was doing as a tour guide. And so over the last, let's see, 9 years, I guess it's been, I've written 5 books, if you count the new one, which hopefully will be coming out next spring. Yeah, 5 books in 9 years. Feels more like 9 books in 5 years. But anyway, and as you mentioned, 2 of them are about the TCD, 10 Crucial Days. Everything has to have an acronym. Third book, John Haslett, is not about the TCD per se, but obviously delves into it quite substantially. And given what happened with his Delaware Regiment and him. And then the last book, as you mentioned, is the Harlem Heights book, is part of the West Home Small Battle series. And I enjoyed doing that because I had the pleasure and the privilege of working with not only Bruce Franklin, who's the editor of West Home, but
Right,
also Jim Martin and Mark
right,
Lender, the
right.
co-editors for that series. So yeah, so that's really what I've been doing, and that all kind of, set the stage for this new book, which will, I guess you could say, complete my TCD trilogy.
Well, David, how does this book specifically differ from other accounts of Washington's 1776, 1777 winter campaign? There are a lot of books out there, I know, about the Mid-Atlantic campaigns and which embodies that campaign as well. But how does your book that specifically differ from the other accounts?
Uh, my book is not so much a chronology of the 10 Crucial Days campaign as what I like to call a thematic interpretation, which is another way of saying that it's the framework is built around these five analytical factors that I think plays an outsized role in determining the outcome of the campaign, and that I think had a mutually um, reinforcing or self-reinforcing
Hmm.
effect. So the other books that have been written, at least the ones with which I'm familiar, and I've delved into you know quite a few of them, as you can imagine, um, are primarily chronological, as I think it's fair to say most historical works are. And that's not to suggest that they're devoid of analytical content. One of the things I particularly like about David Hackett Fisher's book, Washington's Crossing, which of course
Hmm.
won the Pulitzer Prize in '05, I think it was, and which is the Bible for people like me who want to give tours at Washington Crossing Historic Park, is that there is a lot of analytical content in his narrative,
Hmm.
but still it primarily follows a chronological time frame. So what I've done in my book, just to delve briefly into the specifics of how the content is organized, is in the introduction, I do give the reader a synoptic chronology of what happened during the 10 Crucial Days campaign and a brief overview of what the state of the revolutionary conflict was prior to that
Hmm.
campaign and afterwards, so that the reader can get a sense of what the significance of these events were. And then I follow that with a series of 5 chapters, each of which focuses on uh, a different factor, which in order are, and this is what I've suggested in the book, is what I feel is the order of priority as far as their relative contributions to what happened. These would be leadership, uh, geography, weather, artillery, and contingency, which is an elegant term for sheer dumb luck. And obviously there's overlap, between these 5 factors, as I mentioned up front. And I also say that I don't go to great lengths to try to um, clarify to the distinctions, say, that are there between the factors, because I think it would probably be a um, exercise in futility. There are obvious cases where you can see the overlap. For example, where does contingency begin and weather end, or vice versa? But contingency, as I've construed it, is a broader factor than weather. Weather is an important element of that, but not the only one, because it also gets into considerations of decisions and actions by command on both sides, and what ensued from that. Um, so that's the outlay of the book. Now, what I did do in order to reinforce this um, analytical flavor, if you will, is I've included in one of the appendices, at least it's in the manuscript now, um, uh, Appendix I've actually tried to, and this was not my idea. I give credit where credit is due. hopefully people will think it's a good idea. This was Jim Martin's idea. He, among his many distinctions, he was has been a visiting professor at West Point and at the Citadel, and he thought it would be a neat idea, and that faculty in places like that would really that this idea would really resonate with them, to try to devise a quantitative assessment of the contribution made by each of these factors. And that's what I try to do in Appendix A. And I confess in the lead into that it's a, purely subjective enterprise. Well, maybe not purely, but highly subjective. I certainly wouldn't contend that nobody else could do it better, but this was my best effort to do that, where I actually attributed points to various elements within each of these 5 factors, and then came up with a total score for each one, and based on that calculated what I call the percentage contribution. So that's really getting into the nitty gritty of trying to ascertain what these factors contributed. But that's certainly something you're not going to find in any other book that I'm aware of about the TCD campaign, or about the revolution in general, for that matter.
Yeah.
So that's really what the layout of the book is.
Okay. Well, actually, you answered my third question, which I was going to have you explain to the viewers and the listeners the analytical factors that the book was framed around, and you did a nice job of explaining that. You care to offer any other observation?
I guess the only one I would make is that, and I say this, in the narrative, in the introduction, that leadership was clearly the priority here, the paramount factor.
Right.
And in this quantitative assessment that I referred to, I think that, the numbers make that very clear. That uninspired or incompetent leadership on the part of Washington and the American command would not have been able to take advantage of the opportunity that was presented to them in this campaign by the confluence or influence of these other factors. So it starts with leadership, which I think is probably begging begging the obvious. And then these other elements come into play, and as it's sort of as I'm talking, I'm thinking of at the end of the chapter in contingency, I alluded to a quote that I think was made famous by someone, not a professional historian, but someone, interestingly enough, from the world of professional sports, and that's the legendary baseball executive Branch Rickey, who said that luck is the residue of design. And so, which is, it was interesting to think about. I'm not taking a position one way or the other, but that's, another way of saying, if you buy that logic, that as has been said, you need to be lucky to be good. You need to be good to be lucky. So, to a certain extent, I think that entered into what transpired during this campaign.
Well, David, you devote considerable attention to 2 relatively obscure American officers, speaking of leadership, who figured prominently in this campaign. You don't hear their names too often in other books about this period or this particular campaign, and that's Edward Hand and John Cadwalader. Why did you select them in terms of leadership examples and embodying some of these factors?
Well, Edward Hand is someone I've written about at length, actually, in the past, primarily in regard to my second book, The Road to Assunpink Creek, which in fact I dedicated to the memory of Hand and the men he led into battle on January 2nd, 1777. Also wrote an article, as I recall, about him for the Journal of the American Revolution. And he, without going into a great deal of detail, he was a colonel at the time of the TCD campaign, leading the 1st Pennsylvania Regiment, a rifle regiment. He later went on to become a brigadier general, and in fact was the last adjutant general of the Continental Army. He was with Washington at Yorktown. But for my money, the reason why he, in my opinion, is deserves to be considered one of the most unsung patriot or American military heroes of this conflict was really because of what he did on one day, January 2nd, 1777, when he led the about 1,000 men fighting a delaying action against a force that was at least 6 times their size, led by General Cornwallis, Charles Earl Cornwallis, who was leading an army from Princeton down to Trenton in search of Washington's army that he was seeking to destroy. The delaying action that he led that day foiled Cornwallis's attempt to, well, achieve its objective, which was to get to Trenton early enough to fight a battle in which he expected and intended to essentially eliminate Washington's army as an effective fighting force. Well, he wasn't able to do that because, thanks to the effort of Hand's men, and also, to be fair, the road conditions, the abysmal road conditions that existed because of mud that stemmed from rain the night before. By the time Cornwallis got to Trenton, it was too late in the day to fight that decisive battle, and there was some fighting, but he had to put that off his main thrust until the next morning. And of course, overnight, Washington's army pulled off their version of the Great Escape and went up to Princeton and went on from there. Now, John Cadwalader, I have not written at length about. Well, let me rephrase that. I did write an article in the journal about him last year, and also happened to me. I was fortunate enough to meet his great granddaughter, who Sandy Cadwalader, who lives in Philadelphia, and she came up to the park where I work, and I gave her a tour, and she filled in some of the gaps in my knowledge about him. She's done a lot of research and writing about him, and he and Washington were part of a mutual admiration society. They had known each other for several years before the war began, and it's clear from what they say to each other in their correspondence that they both had a very high opinion of each other. And Cadwalader is one of these people who played I think, a very unheralded role in the TCD campaign in a number of respects, without going into a lot of detail. But the dispatch he sent to Washington after Cadwalader's men, the Philadelphia Associators, crossed the Delaware on December 27th. They were too late to support Washington's effort against the Hessians in the first battle, but they did finally get across the river, and he sent a dispatch to Washington, which reported on the situation there and encouraged Washington, who had then returned to Pennsylvania, to renew his offensive, to come back to New Jersey, and which Washington obviously did. Then Cadwalader, a few days later, conveyed to Washington a spy map that he had drawn up based on intel he received from an unidentified spy in Princeton, which showed the vulnerability of British defenses, such as they were in and around the town at the time. And then finally, he played a important leadership role at the Battle of Princeton, which was recognized by others, such as Joseph Reed, and who was the Army's adjutant general at the time, and Nathaniel Greene, one of Washington's division commanders. So for all those reasons, I think Cadwalader is a fellow who I think anybody who certainly is a Rev War buff ought to know something about. He's a interesting revolutionary because he was a child of privilege. He was an affluent merchant in Philadelphia when the war broke out. He and his wife lived in one of the most splendid houses in the city. But he, like Washington, his friend, had economic grievances against the crown for their colonial policies, and he was an avid revolutionary.
Yeah. I'm so glad you decided to talk a little bit about them. But there was another person too that played a pretty significant role as well. Could you talk a little bit about Henry Knox and how important he was to the campaign?
Yes, one of the historians who I quoted, I don't remember who it was though, in the narrative, said that if Washington, which of course a lot of people would contend, um, was the indispensable figure in the revolution, Henry Knox was his indispensable subordinate. He was with Washington at every single major military engagement where GW was during the course of the conflict. He was I think he had to be really a genius.
Yeah,
Um, the way he was able to teach himself the minutia of a very arcane subject, artillery,
right.
um, and which of course he had no formal training in, but clearly very, very astute fellow and a astute commander of men. He created the Army's artillery wing from scratch, molded it into an effective fighting force um, in time for this campaign and throughout the
Hmm.
war. And artillery, as I mentioned, is one of the key factors in the campaign. Um, the I think it was absolutely critical to the outcome of all three battles that the Americans had a decided advantage in terms of
Hmm.
the numerical superiority um, in terms of field pieces during the first battle of Trenton, the second battle of Trenton, or the Battle of
Hmm.
Assunpink Creek, and the Battle of Princeton. And of course, Knox was the single most important person in
Yeah.
terms of organizing that and directing that artillery effectively. And also, we should mention in this context that he, at Washington's direction, superintended the legendary Christmas night crossing. Um, and he had maybe as befits somebody who weighed 300 some pounds, he had a booming voice, which was very important in contending with the elements in directing the troops on Christmas night, 1776, in the middle of a blizzard.
Yeah.
And so for all those reasons, he is, I think we can say without a shred of hyperbole, um, after Washington, this is just me speaking, but after Washington, I think you can make the case that he was the second most important
Yeah.
military figure, American military figure in this conflict.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I certainly agree with that. I think that I'm surprised that there are too few books on Henry Knox. I read Mark Pohl's book several years ago, and I was just blown away by so much information about the things that Knox was involved with that Americans just simply and historians simply don't know anything about. I mean,
Yeah.
he's so invaluable, like a really not only an unsung hero, but he operated so much behind the scenes. And I mean, he was just a brilliant walking and talking encyclopedia of knowledge.
Hmm.
I guess that came from reading all these military books at his bookstore prior to getting involved in in the
Right.
campaign. But
Right.
nevertheless, I think he really is an unsung hero and an outstanding military leader. Uh, can you give us a couple examples or instances where you think contingency, one of your factors, uh, may have been a factor in influencing, may or may not have been a factor in influencing the outcome of the campaign?
Sure. I think the two that most readily come to mind, they may have been the first two I cited in that chapter, actually. Well, I know this first one was the first one I cited, and this is in regard to Charles Lee, General
Hmm.
Charles Lee, who of course was Washington's second in command um, in 1776, prior to the TCD campaign. Um, Lee, without going into too much detail about that, um, at the time, remember after the New York campaign, which was a litany of, if not disasters, semi-disasters
Yeah.
for the Continental Army, uh, a growing number of officers in the Army and members of Congress too, and Lee in particular, were beginning to, or in Lee's case, I think he was way past beginning, doubt Washington's efficacy as commander-in-chief.
Yeah.
Because they felt he had been, a fairly inept, indecisive leader during the New York campaign, which arguably he had been. And so I think one could reasonably infer from Lee's commentary then that he clearly, to say the least, had his doubts about Washington, and arguably felt that he, General Lee, really should be the commander-in-chief, as I'm sure some other people felt too. And so he, at this time, acted in a way that suggests he clearly felt that he was not bound by directions that Washington was giving him, even if in this case they were not necessarily explicit orders, but clearly clear suggestions, to say the least. What I'm talking about is when Washington, he split his army, as he was wont to do in certain situations, which from a purely conventional military standpoint did not make sense. But he took part of his army over to New Jersey in early November 1776 to guard against the anticipated British invasion of the state. But he left Lee's force on the New York side of the Hudson River, then the North River, to guard against any move against New England. Well, once Washington gets over to the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware, his army is shrinking, his battered army, shrinking from desertions and expired enlistments, and he's desperate for reinforcements. And he knows he needs those to preserve the viability of his army and any opportunity for, launching a counterstrike against the enemy. So there's a series of letters he sends to, dispatches he sends to Lee with ever increasing desperation, practically begging him to bring his army across the state to join up with Washington's forces, and Lee takes his own sweet time doing that. Well, on December 13th, the night of, or I guess it was the night of the 12th and 13th, for some unexplained reason, I don't think historians have a clear idea why he did this. I know there's one suggestion that he was looking for female companionship, but I don't know whether that played a role or not. But he absented himself from his encampment with some of his officers, his guard. He spent the night several miles away at a tavern in Basking Ridge, New Jersey. And the next morning, a group of British dragoons, who I guess had received intel from a local loyalist, swooped down on the tavern and captured Lee. And at that point, that was regarded by both sides as, I think, close to, if not an unmitigated disaster for the Patriot cause, because it was felt by many, and certainly it appears that the British felt this way, that Lee was clearly the best general the Americans had. And with his capture, the American army, which already had been battered during the New York campaign, was on the verge, really on the verge of collapse. There's even a school of thought, although I tended to poo-poo this, that General Howe may have, decided to send his army into winter quarters on December 14th, because he figured, well, we've got, I don't know if he knew on December 14th that they had captured Lee, but, that he figured, okay, we got Lee, the game is over, we can go into winter quarters. I don't think that was the case. But anyway, but as it turns out, I think it's fair to say now that most, if not all, historians would contend that that was probably the single best thing that could have happened to Washington, because now he no longer had Lee, who clearly, cast aspersions on Washington's leadership abilities, looking over his shoulder and questioning his orders. And Washington was kind of liberated in a sense, to be his own man, to do his own thing. Plus, once Lee was captured, his second in command, General Sullivan, promptly led Lee's contingent, 2,000 men, down to, they crossed the Delaware at Easton, I believe, and they marched down to Washington's encampment and joined up with his forces. And then, Washington needed that to happen before he could really even begin to think realistically about
Right.
launching a counterattack. So that's a maybe first and foremost among the contingencies that strikes me. The other is I won't go into as much detail about that, but on Christmas night, 1776, a group of, unbeknownst to Washington, a group of about 50 American Continentals from Virginia crossed the Delaware, and this was late in the day, Christmas Day, crossed the Delaware at the direction of their brigade commander, General Adam Stephen, who Washington had known for a long time, I think from the French and Indian War, although they apparently were not exactly buddy-buddy. Stephen apparently was miffed that the Hessians had the temerity to shoot one of his men on the river a few days before, so he sends this detachment across the river to harass the Hessians without telling Washington he's doing this. And they do that. They fire at some Hessian outposts, and then they retreat back into the woods. Washington doesn't find out about this until in the early morning hours, the next morning when his army's approaching Trenton after they cross the river, and he runs into these American skirmishers, if you will, coming back from Trenton, and finds out what they had done. And he's furious because he thinks they've blown his cover, furious at Stephen. And but as it turns out, they may have done Washington a huge favor because Colonel Johann Rall, the Hessian
Right.
Brigade commander in Trenton, had apparently received a written warning from General James Grant, the British commander in New Jersey at the time, based on intel from a British spy, that Washington was planning an attack. Although Grant kind of, given his singular contempt for the Americans, downplayed the probability of this happening, but basically said, I'm doing my due diligence and I'm letting you know this is a possibility. Well, we don't know what Rawls' mindset was, but it's not unreasonable to infer that after this raid, he may very well have thought that that was the attack about which he had been warned. And if that was the case, then perhaps he was not quite as vigilant as he would have otherwise been. We know that the Hessians apparently canceled their early morning patrol the next morning, which I think was about the weather more than anything else, because it was so bad out. They figured nobody in their right mind would, want to be operating in that kind of weather. But who knows? Maybe this entered into that.
Could have. That's interesting perspective, to say the least. Yeah. Well, here at the Real American Revolution, we always like to dispel myths that hide our patriotic past, as historian Ray Raphael likes to say. So, what are some of the myths that your book seeks to dispel?
Well, without going into a lot of detail on them, I would say there are a few from the. I'll start with the micro and go to the macro. A couple of things about the Hessians. We've been taught over the generations, over the centuries, I guess, that the Hessian soldiers were mercenaries. I don't think that's really accurate in the sense that most people, or at least I understand what a mercenary is. I think it's more accurate to call them auxiliaries, because these soldiers were not being paid directly for their service with the British troops in America. They were paid, of course, based on their service in the army back in their respective provinces in what is today Germany, and probably well paid by the standards of the time in their, where they lived, in each of those 6 Germanic states or provinces where they came from. But in each case, it was the prince of that state or that province that was receiving the financial benefit of this arrangement with, George III. Although I think the Hessians tried to make up for that lack of extra remuneration by turning looting into an art form when they came over here. But anyway, and the other thing, touching on the Hessians, is this notion that, which you see in traditional accounts, that they were all hungover on the morning of December 26, 1776, when Washington's army arrived. Well, in point of fact, there's nothing in the historical record that supports that idea. Perhaps Colonel Raw was sleeping one off because apparently he went to a late night party at the home of wealthy merchant Abraham Hunt, which lasted into the wee hours of the morning. So maybe he wasn't as clear-eyed as he should have been or could have been. But there's nothing to suggest widespread drinking by the Hessians, and in fact, reports to the contrary, firsthand, from firsthand accounts. And I'm not saying there wasn't a lot of drinking in Trenton at the time. There was, but it was after the battle by American troops who liberated some 40 hogsheads of rum that they found in town. They decided to party hardy until GW found out. Another, on a somewhat grander level, the notion that I think you'll find in perhaps earlier accounts that Washington was kind of waged a defensive war, a war of posts, if you will, with the primary objective being the preservation of his army. Now, clearly he recognized that he must have, that the army was really the principal instrument for securing American independence, and as such, its preservation was essential to the success of the cause. But as one historian said, I think it might have been Ed L'Engle in his military bio of Washington, that this was a fighting general, and he was instinctively aggressive when it came to military tactics, perhaps too much so in certain cases. Clearly, he was so during the TCD, it worked out by, depending on the situation, by skill or maybe by contingency. But throughout the war, he was that way. I mean, he clearly was later on, I think, during the Pennsylvania campaign, Brandywine and Germantown. And he was always seeking to strike at the enemy, whenever he could. He spent years, really, well, right up until right before Yorktown, I suppose, dreaming of launching this grand attack on the British garrison in New York City. So I don't think it's fair to say that he was that he had this defensive mindset. I think it was quite the contrary. And I guess the last thing I would mention, and this really gets into the kind of a more cosmic level of thinking about this, about the war. The assumption, I think, is often made, and certainly was made by traditional accounts of the war, and it plays into legend, myth, whatever you want to call it, lore, Lore, that it was a miracle, that we won the war, and because it was the odds against us were so long. Washington called it a miracle. In point of fact, if we're talking about just winning a military victory, which to my way of thinking is not the same as winning a political victory, and that begs the question of whether the British ever could have won a political victory, even if they had won militarily. But without getting into that, the British really, and I do get into this a little bit, I think in the chapter on geography, they faced two major obstacles, space and place. And what I mean by that was that they had to conquer a vast expanse of territory, which they simply didn't have the manpower to do, even with their, the Hessian auxiliaries. The British Army was not that large at the beginning of the war. It was a capable army, but it wasn't that large. It wasn't like their navy, and that's why George III went out and made this arrangement to secure the Hessian reinforcements. And then the other, of course, was the 3,000-mile long supply line that they had to contend with. So, those were two major challenges, and I don't think that I don't know if it's reasonable that they ever could have really solved those, but they didn't. And so the notion that, it was almost a sure thing that Britain was going to win the military contest in 1776, I think obscures those two really critical facts.
Mhm. Sure. Well, David, at one point you suggested Great Britain needed to win the war quickly if it was to win it at all. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, this relates to the last point I was making. I think, and I think they realized this to a certain extent, in 1776, and that's why they assembled this massive invasion force, that was the largest that had ever sailed across the Atlantic
Hmm.
from east to west, and would be the largest that crossed the pond, so to speak, until the American Expeditionary Force went in the other direction, 1917, to France. So over 400 ships, over 40,000 men, and to launch their assault against Washington's army in New York. And the reason I say that they needed to win it quickly, I think they needed to win quickly to have certainly to have their best chance, and maybe their only chance of scoring a military victory over Washington's army, was because they had this golden opportunity to bottle up that army when it was, geographically concentrated. Once this turned into a war of attrition, where Washington's forces could, and other American forces too, could essentially be less concentrated over this vast expanse of territory, it became much more difficult for the British to launch a successful offensive actions against them. The British Navy, which could support the land forces when they were operating in navigable waters, as they could do obviously in the New York City theater,
Right.
since Manhattan is an island after all. And they were able to surround that. They couldn't do that. They could only advance so far into the interior of these provinces. And then, of course, it was, as I mentioned before, singularly difficult to try to supply the army with what it needed to carry on this sustained struggle over an 8-year-long war of attrition when it was operating 3,000 miles from the homeland, and both, which obviously presented difficulties in terms of providing reinforcements and supplies and equipment, and timely orders to British commanders in the field. And so that wasn't something that I think either the military commanders or the ministers of London ever really figured out a way to successfully deal with. But clearly, I think their best chance to win, for those reasons, was to do it quickly, and they weren't able to, and became much more difficult after that. And I think they recognized that. General Howe, in his correspondence with Lord George Germain, the British Secretary of State, in the wake of the TCD, I think essentially admitted to that.
Yeah, because after Monmouth, of course, the British emphasis shifted to the South in particular, with the Savannah and Charleston and so forth. And of course, they got even more entwined in a war of attrition, if you will, with trying to establish supply lines in the South. So do you really think that Britain's best chance of maybe winning the war was during the New Jersey campaign, if they'd been able to pull it off?
I think, as one might have inferred from what I was saying in the answer to the last question, I think their best chance was during the New York campaign.
Okay.
I am not sure. I could speculate why. He may have had multiple reasons for doing this. But General Howe did not take advantage of the golden opportunity that was presented to him, and which other British officers, especially Henry Clinton, one of his senior commanders, who Howe apparently didn't have a high regard for, urged him to do, and that was to essentially seal off the potential escape route for Washington's army once they were on Manhattan Island. This would have been after the Battle of Long Island, when
Right.
Washington was able to evacuate half his army, the half of his army that had been engaged, across the East River back to Manhattan. And then they subsequently, excuse me, had to evacuate the city and retreated up to northern Manhattan. After the Battle of Harlem Heights, Washington's army was stationed in that locale for about a month. And I think the battle was fought on September 16th. They didn't start to evacuate the island until it was October 14th or 15th. And just in time too, because Howe had just launched what was essentially a flanking move, trying to land men on well, first they tried at Throg's Neck, that didn't work out, and then Pell's Point a few days later, in order to do what he should have done several weeks before, to cut off that escape route. Had they captured King's Bridge, which was that escape route from the northern tip of Manhattan Island to the mainland, to the Westchester mainland, I don't see that there would have been any way out for Washington's army, because, as I said before, the British controlled the waterways around Manhattan. And I recall in reading, when I was writing the Hazlitt book, Colonel Hazlitt writing to, I think it was his buddy Caesar Rodney, where he essentially said the same thing. And so I don't know why Washington dallied for so long. I don't know why Howe dallied for so long, although, as I said, I could speculate about that. But it is of an incalculable good fortune to Washington and his so-called glorious cause that Howe did dither like that, because I think that was his best chance to, wrap things up. Now we could, I'm not going to do it, but we could, and I'm sure some historians would question whether, if that had happened and, Washington's army had been effectively neutralized, would that have been the end of the conflict? But clearly, it would have made a huge difference.
Right.
And, I think it's fair to say that for whatever reason, Howe blew it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as we wrap up for our last question, what's the one takeaway that you think readers and listeners should remember about your book? What's the key thing that's stands out to you as the one thing, if they didn't remember everything else, what's the one thing they did to take away from winning the 10 Crucial Days?
I think it would be, I would hope, an appreciation of the degree to which multiple factors can influence the outcome of an event or a series of events, in ways that may be entirely unpredictable.
Yeah.
It reminds me of a quote that I cited in the chapter on contingency from the von Clausewitz's book, Von Krieg on War, is his famous military treatise from 1832, where he says, "In war, more than anywhere else, things do not turn out as we expect." So that's contingency for you. And that has a lot to do, as I mentioned in the narrative, that has a lot to do with the fact that a battle plan is often the first casualty of the battle.
Sure.
So, we see that here in this campaign as in other instances. So, clearly, the aggregate effect of these multiple influences played a huge role, as I've suggested. That's the theme of the book. In one of what is clearly recognized, I believe, is one of the most storied campaigns in military history. And and we can say that about other military ventures as well. And, non-military events too. So, I think that would be the biggest thing that I would like readers to glean from it. And hopefully it's kind of, belabors the obvious when I say that. Certainly, I think it would be hard for them to get through the narrative. They can get through the narrative and not come to a similar conclusion.
Oh my gosh, I agree with you. Well, David, thanks so much for joining me today. To our viewers and listeners, I've been talking with historian David Price, author of Winning the 10 Crucial Days, an outstanding history, soon to be available on Amazon and eBooks. Now, my name is Randy Flood. So join us again next time for another exciting interview with an outstanding historian to talk about the real American Revolution. David, thank you so much. Really
Thank you,
appreciate it.
Randy.
Yeah. So long for now.